Not because it was there, because it was there too early. Naomi Pierce-Rhodes stood alone in the glass conference room on the 49th floor, one hand still resting on the back of a leather chair, staring at the draft crisis statement glowing on the screen in front of her. The city glittered behind the windows. Midtown pulsed below in ribbons of white and red. Somewhere, out in the hallway, someone laughed softly. Ice touched crystal. A door opened and closed. Everything beyond the glass remained perfectly normal. But on the screen, in crisp legal language polished by people who billed by the hour and slept very well at night, was the line that made Naomi read the paragraph again, and then again. Pending further review, operational and strategic responsibility appears to rest with Naomi Pierce-Rhodes. For one strange second, she thought she had misunderstood it. A placeholder, maybe. A draft too early to mean anything. A phrasing legal would tighten later. An internal note not meant to survive final review. Then she scrolled down. There it was again. Careful sorrow. Institutional regret. A measured nod to complexity. And beneath all of it, the elegant architecture of a lie being assembled in real time, one polished enough to survive headlines, donor calls, and board scrutiny long enough to do what it was designed to do. Give the foundation a body to throw over the fire. Hers. Naomi did not sit down, did not call out, did not storm into the adjacent room where her husband was speaking in that low, warm, public voice he used whenever wealthy people needed to feel reassured by a man who had not yet earned the calm he was performing. She just stood there, still. Because sometimes the first feeling betrayal gives you is not pain. It is disbelief. It is the mind's brief, desperate refusal to accept that people you have spent years protecting have finally arranged the version of events in which you are the safest thing to lose. By the end of that week, Evan Rhodes would no longer control the public narrative of the Rhodes Future Foundation. His father, Bernard Rhodes, would discover that institutional authority becomes fragile the moment truth stops cooperating with legacy. And Naomi, the woman they had praised for being brilliant, measured, discreet, and endlessly dependable, would understand, finally, that there is a terrible difference between being valued and being loved. Before I tell you how a woman spent 11 years quietly holding a philanthropic empire together only to realize they had chosen her as the cleanest place to bury their damage, stay with me. Because this story is not really about scandal. It is about the moment someone you trusted decides that your loyalty makes you the easiest person to sacrifice. For most of her adult life, Naomi Pierce-Rhodes had been described in language that sounded respectful until you listened closely enough to hear what it was avoiding. Steady, refined, brilliant behind the scenes. The woman who kept everything elegant. It was the kind of praise powerful institutions love to give women whose labor they depend on, but whose authority they have no intention of naming plainly. Naomi did not merely make things elegant, she made them survive. 11 years earlier, before the Rhodes Future Foundation became the kind of Manhattan institution senators, venture philanthropists, celebrity founders, and policy journalists competed to be associated with, it had been something much more dangerous beneath the shine. A high-visibility family operation with too much money, too much confidence, weak internal discipline, and a disastrous tendency to confuse intention with governance. Naomi had changed that. Not publicly, not in the language that looked good on magazine profiles, but in the deeper way that actually matters. She redesigned donor accountability structures, rebuilt external trust after a disastrous expansion promise Bernard should never have made in public, stabilized two leadership transitions that would have shattered confidence if the press had caught the fractures early. wrote the internal crisis protocol that allowed the foundation to survive its first serious reputational threat without exposing how close it had come to becoming exactly what wealthy family charities so often become: a moral costume for private ego. When Naomi first met Evan, he seemed grateful for this kind of mind. That was what made the later years so difficult to grieve honestly. He had not begun as a simple villain. He was charming then in a way that still felt human. Sharp, ambitious, restless, yes, but not yet fully reorganized around being admired. He listened when she spoke, asked real questions, corrected people when they overlooked her. Once, after watching her calmly dismantle a donor panic over dinner with nothing but patience and one devastatingly precise question, he had leaned in and said, almost in wonder, "You make big things feel honest again." Naomi believed him. Maybe he meant it then. But there is a quiet rot that enters certain marriages when one person grows too used to standing on the structures the other keeps building beneath them. At first, admiration looks like intimacy. Then it becomes reliance. Then, if character fails, it hardens into entitlement so smoothly the person benefiting from it may never even call it by its real name. Evan loved what Naomi made possible. He loved how coherent he sounded after speaking with her, how much calmer board meetings went when she had privately corrected the chaos before he entered the room, how his leadership seemed deeper, steadier, more serious after her thinking had passed through it. What he did not know how to love for very long was the truth hidden beneath that comfort, that much of what the world admired in him had first been rescued, sharpened, or prevented from failing by a woman half a step outside the frame. His mother, Victoria Rhodes, recognized the tension years before he did. She was not a loud woman. Women like Victoria almost never need to be. She understood the older, cleaner form of violence, the one performed through etiquette, strategic praise, and beautifully worded diminishment. "Naomi has such a gift for containment," she once said over lunch to two trustees and a tech billionaire's wife. "She brings emotional architecture to rooms full of men who would otherwise build too fast." Everyone loved that line. Naomi smiled too. But she felt, even then, the private sting of hearing herself translated into atmosphere. Containment, emotional architecture, grace under pressure. Beautiful words, useful words, none of them named the harder truth. That when the foundation nearly broke 3 years earlier under a donor revolt, a compliance gap, and a media leak that never fully surfaced only because Naomi got there first, it had been her mind, not Bernard's authority, not Evan's charm, not Victoria's social instincts that saved them. And that had become the pattern of the family. When things were fragile, Naomi was central. When things were stable, she became support. When consequences threatened, she was indispensable. When praise was distributed, her role blurred into texture. A speech draft she wrote became Evan's tone. A donor family she recovered became evidence of Bernard's steady leadership. A legal strategy she designed became the foundation's thoughtful response. Every incident by itself seemed survivable. That is how erosion works. Not through one great wound. Through repetition, elegant enough to teach you to doubt your own right to keep calling it injury. At first, Naomi corrected things, gently, privately, without drama. She told herself she did not need performance, did not need applause, did not need to be worshipped in rooms full of people whose moral imagination had been softened by too much marble, too much legacy, too many years of never hearing the word no. She only needed one thing: that when the truth bent visibly in front of him, Evan would love her enough to set it back. Instead, he kept offering the same cultivated reasonableness that often marks the beginning of a woman's loneliness more accurately than cruelty does. You know how these rooms work. It wasn't intentional. Not everything has to be corrected in real time. You matter more than public optics. Why let small things poison what we actually have? What we actually have. Naomi held on to that phrase for years. Because there is a particularly intimate kind of pain that comes from being asked again and again to prove the depth of your love by remaining calm inside your own diminishment. 9 months before the statement appeared on that screen, the foundation entered the kind of danger wealthy institutions often assume they can out-talk until the facts grow teeth. A high-profile education tech initiative tied to the foundation's next expansion phase began to wobble after internal review surfaced donor route inconsistencies, premature public commitments, and a funding structure that looked visionary from the podium but alarmingly unstable in legal reality. The press had not found it yet. Book Council had. 2 major donors were already asking careful questions. A third was preparing to pause. Bernard wanted to project certainty. Victoria wanted narrative discipline. Evan wanted time. Naomi did what she had always done. She moved first. She rebuilt the internal review sequence, restructured the donor communication map, contained exposure, drafted the compliance bridge, reconstructed the decision trail cleanly enough that, if corrected in time, the initiative might survive without public collapse. And buried inside the continuity package she drafted to protect the foundation from future reputational misrepresentation was a clause very few people bothered to track carefully after signing. Conditional executive override rights. Temporary, legally reviewable. Activated only if institutional integrity was threatened by material misrepresentation of responsibility, fiduciary misconduct, or false public attribution tied to operational leadership. Naomi built it because someone had to imagine the day charm and inheritance would no longer be enough to protect them from themselves. She did not expect to need it against her own husband. At least, not consciously. But the wiser part of us often leaves doors unlocked for the version of ourselves still too hopeful to know why. And now, there it was. Her name inside the statement. Her body being measured for the fall before the fire had even fully reached the curtains. Naomi kept reading. The language was immaculate. That was what made it obscene. Not blame exactly, not crude accusation, something colder. The foundation remained deeply grateful for Naomi's years of service. Naomi had been given wide strategic discretion during a period of fast-moving complexity. The current concerns appeared to reflect an overextension of operational judgment rather than deliberate misconduct. It was the kind of statement designed by intelligent cowards. Warm enough to look humane, precise enough to ruin one person while preserving the institution and the men who had built their reputations on top of it. And beneath the legal polish, Naomi recognized something more personal than scandal. This was not panic writing. This had been discussed, refined, approved, emotionally prepared for. Her husband had read this. Her father-in-law had blessed it. Her mother-in-law had almost certainly improved the tone. And somewhere in that process, each of them had reached the same conclusion. Naomi would carry it better than they would. That realization did not break her. It clarified her. Because for years she had been asking the wrong question. Do they understand what I carry? Of course they did. That was why they chose her. They knew exactly how much pressure she could absorb, exactly how gracefully she could stand inside damage and keep the walls from shaking. They were counting on the same strength they had spent years praising to finally make her disappear usefully. Naomi closed the file, forwarded a copy to a secure private archive, then opened the internal version history and began pulling what she would need. Every authorship trail, every approval chain, every donor warning flag, every compliance note Bernard had downplayed, every strategic correction she had recommended and Evan had delayed until reality forced movement. Every instance where public-facing language had separated responsibility from decision-making just enough to preserve the family and isolate the operator. The more she collected, the calmer she became. That is one of the strange mercies of truth. When pain stops feeling personal and starts taking the shape of pattern, you no longer have to spend energy asking whether you are overreacting. You can finally ask a better question. What, exactly, have they prepared me to survive? 2 hours later, Evan found her in the apartment library. No glass wall now, no board members, no legal counsel. Just the quiet room where so much of their marriage had once been patched together through gentleness, fatigue, and carefully rationed honesty. He looked tired. Concerned in the polished way high-functioning men learn to appear when they sense a situation may still be managed if they enter it calmly enough. "You left early," he said. Naomi looked up from her laptop. "I read the statement." The pause that followed was very small. But in marriage, there are pauses that contain entire funerals. Evan stepped farther into the room. "It's a draft." She held his eyes. "So was I." That landed. He looked away first. "Naomi, this is bigger than one sentence." She almost smiled. That was always how people like him framed it when they needed her to abandon the moral center of a problem in favor of its scale. "No," she said softly. "It's exactly one sentence. That's why it tells the truth so clearly." He tried reason, pressure, institutional burden, the old language of complexity. The board is nervous. Donors need containment. We have to protect the foundation. Nobody is trying to hurt you. You know how these things work. But Naomi heard, finally, what lived beneath it all. "We need you to absorb the blast because you've always been the one who could." There are moments when love does not die dramatically. It dies because one person keeps asking whether the other will still make themselves useful at the exact moment usefulness becomes indistinguishable from self-betrayal. Naomi closed the laptop. "No," she said. "Just that. No explanation, no tears, no appeal." And for the first time in years, Evan looked not frustrated, but frightened. By morning, board counsel had the full record. By noon, 2 major donors had corrected timelines showing where decision authority had actually lived. By late afternoon, the contingency mechanism Naomi had drafted 9 months earlier was formally triggered under review for material misrepresentation and fiduciary exposure. The statement never went public. Instead, the board called an emergency session. The room was long, cold, and lined with the kind of expensive wood institutions use to make power feel civilized. Bernard arrived in authority, Victoria in composure, Evan in the remains of confidence. Naomi arrived with the truth. No performance, no vengeance, no raised voice, just documentation. The warning flags she had written, the decisions they had overridden, the donor notes they had ignored, the revisions they had delayed, the draft statement they had prepared to place operational accountability on the one person who had spent years preventing their carelessness from becoming visible. By the time the final folder closed, the room had changed, not emotionally, structurally. That is how real reversals happen, not when people become shocked. When systems stop cooperating with the lie, Bernard's discretionary authority was suspended pending full review. Evan lost transition-facing representation. The Foundation's official narrative was corrected before release. And Naomi, the woman they had prepared to sacrifice because they trusted her to carry it elegantly, became the only person in the room whose credibility remained fully intact. Afterward, Evan followed her into the corridor outside the boardroom. He looked pale now, smaller, like a man who had spent too many years confusing access to someone's strength with ownership of it. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said. Naomi turned toward him. "I gave you years," she said quietly. "This is just the first time I stopped doing it your way." He had no answer, because the last truth in a relationship is rarely new. It is simply the first one, no longer softened enough to protect the person who refused to hear it earlier. Naomi did not feel triumph. That would have made the story flatter than life usually is. What she felt instead was grief, sharpened into clarity. Not only for the marriage, for the version of herself who had spent too long mistaking discretion for intimacy, who kept believing that being indispensable would eventually become the same thing as being honored, who thought the people she protected would never one day look at that loyalty and decide it was the cleanest place to hide their damage. The Foundation survived. In some ways, it became more honest. The donors stayed. The review moved forward. The institution was forced, at last, to tell the truth about what had actually been holding it together. Bernard kept his surname and lost his certainty. Victoria kept her grace and lost the comfort of arranging reality through tone alone. Evan kept the painful knowledge that he had not lost Naomi because of one bad week. He lost her gradually. Each time he accepted her silence as proof that the wound was bearable. Each time he let her labor remain visible only when it could save him. Each time he confused love with the right to hand her the bill for his failures. And Naomi? She changed in the only way that finally mattered. She did not become cruel. She became exact. She stopped translating herself into softer language so other people could keep feeling large, stopped confusing being needed with being cherished, stopped believing dignity arrives after other people to recognize it. Dignity begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment you refuse to become the cleanest place for someone else to bury their damage. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what hurts more in the end? The scandal itself, or the moment you realize the people who said they loved you had already decided you would be the easiest person to sacrifice? Some people don't betray you by leaving. They betray you by deciding you'll carry the fall better than they will. I'll see you in the next story.